Steak Frites is a legend. It's built to impress and it also just tastes delicious. So today I'm making steak, fries, and 3 delicious classic sauce options that range from fast and easy to culinary flex. My steak Frites steak of choice is a strip steak with the fat trimmed off. Tempering steaks, also known as letting them sit at room temperature before you cook them, is always a hot topic on the internet. The only advice I can give you is if you consistently overcook your steaks, then don't temper them. But if you consistently undercook your steaks, you should probably consider tempering them. Personally, I go hot and fast, smoke alarms be damned, so I do like a well-tempered steak. I'm gonna set this aside at room temperature while I work on the first sauce option. First up is a compound butter. There are as many compound butters as there are ingredients in the world, but this is easily one of my favorites. I started with 1 small or half a large shallot that I chopped and then minced as fine as possible. Next up is anchovy. I know there are many of you out there that have yet to eat an anchovy that you liked, so feel free to leave them out. But these days, I've been really enjoying these Fishwife Cantabrian guys. But pick your favorite and mince up 4 fillets. Capers are next. Personally, I much prefer to use the capers packed in salt because they taste much better, and I actually find that they save me money in the long run because I don't pour out half the brine when I just need a tiny little bit of capers. These things will sit in my pantry for years before I need a few. Then I'll put them into a strainer and rinse the salt off. I chopped up a tablespoon of them, and finally parsley, which is the most basic and thus most versatile of the fresh herbs. I basically never use salted butter at home, but compound butter is the perfect time for it. That said, I've got a lot of unsalted butter in my freezer from a recent job, so I started with 3 sticks and added sea salt and really worked the butter with a wooden spoon to soften it and whip it up a little. Then I added all of the deliciousness and folded that in. You can put this into a container if you'd like and just spoon it out, but I like to roll my compound butters. There's a couple of ways of doing it, but I think the plastic wrap method is the best because it's easiest to get a reasonably good log. Grab a length of plastic and spread the butter out in an even layer on it, and then use the plastic wrap to shape it into a log. Roll the plastic over, and then as you pinch the ends, roll it until it's a nice shape. If you're happy with your shape and want to keep it perfect, put it into an ice bath afterwards to firm it up. This butter is delicious. It's got a lot of sweetness and complexity and brine, and a slice of it goes beautifully on a warm steak. Next up are the fries. I searched for Kennebec potatoes because they're the best for fries, but where I'm currently living in Central Texas, there are none to be found. So I went with the classic russet, which I peeled and then sliced into strips that are about as narrow as my pinky. When I taught at the former French Culinary Institute in New York, we had an entire section dedicated to the many French preparations of the fried potato. But you don't need to get caught up in a specific size, just try to keep them consistent. And I think that if they're about pinky width, they will be a nice combination of crispy on the outside and fluffy on the inside. Cover them with water, pour it out, and repeat a few times until the water is clear. This will remove surface starch to increase surface area, which makes your fry much crispier. If you've never tried a spud fried in beef tallow, you are in for a treat. I'm working on a fat rendering short to show you how to make your own, but you can also just buy this on Amazon, at least here in the States. If not, peanut oil or canola oil are great options. Great fries are fried twice. So first I'm gonna bring the tallow up to 280 degrees Fahrenheit while I thoroughly dry the potatoes on a clean towel and then carefully lower them into the hot fat. You'll find a lot of very complicated fry recipes on YouTube, and I'm definitely guilty of some fry experimentation myself, but I think this basic one gives you a fry that is so close to the most complicated one if you just pay attention to this one simple step. During this first fry, don't just take the potatoes out once they're soft. Keep cooking them until you start to see the amount of bubbles start to really drop off. For me, that took about 10 minutes. While you're doing it, you want to make sure the temperature does not go above 280 degrees. If it's starting to approach it, turn your heat down a little. These should start to take on a light golden color, and the smaller amount of bubbles means they've started to dry out, which is exactly what you want. Scoop them out onto a tray, resting rack optional, and set them aside for now. As a side note, at this point, these actually freeze quite nicely. So if you feel like you've made too many potatoes, throw them into a bag, pop them in your freezer, and we'll return to the final fry in just a few minutes. Now I'm on to what is admittedly my favorite sauce for this, Bordelaise. It's not even necessarily that it tastes better, but I just love sauce work like this. This is a proper Bordelaise, not a pan sauce version, although it would make a nice pan sauce. I started with a brown veal stock. If you're going store-bought, it can be difficult to find veal stock or bones for that matter, and you can sub beef stock, but make sure to get it unsalted because the first thing we're gonna do is reduce it by at least 2/3. When I first started cooking, somebody telling me to reduce something by 2/3 was very confusing, but approximations are totally fine. You just wanna make sure the majority of the stock has disappeared. One of the hallmarks of Bordelaise is bone marrow, and this part is optional if you'd rather leave it out. But while the stock is reducing, I took a marrow bone and soaked it in heavily salted water. I'm gonna get back to cooking this in just a minute. Once the stock is reduced, I poured it back into the container it was in, and then into the same pot, I added shallots, fresh thyme, and about the same amount of red wine that I have reduced stock. This might get me into trouble with some of my former colleagues, but any dry red wine will work. That said, the sauce is from Burgundy, so you gotta rep the delicious Bordeaux. I reduced this down until it's approaching syrup, and then I added back the reduced stock and continued to reduce the sauce until it started to taste delicious. Tasting these reductions can be difficult because there's no salt in here yet, and it can be hard if your palate isn't trained to know when something tastes great without seasoning it, but you can always sprinkle a couple of grains of salt onto your spoon. While that's going, let's finish poaching our marrow. Add it to a pot of salted water that is just simmering and cook it for about 5 to 6 minutes. If you've never cooked marrow before, it is a delicious, buttery product, but as soon as it gets overcooked, it gets pretty gross. So make sure the water never boils. Once it's done, pull it out and use your finger to pop the marrow out and then mince it up as fine as possible, and let's finish the sauce. If you're serving this right away, you can ignore what I'm about to say, but if you're gonna serve this later, now is the moment to stop and refrigerate because we're about to add butter and the marrow. Once the butter goes in the sauce, it can't be stored and reheated. That said, when you're ready to eat it, optionally strain the sauce. Make sure it's hot, turn the heat off and add cold butter. Swirl it in and then add the bone marrow and season it very lightly with salt. This, to me, is peak French sauce making, particularly if you make your own stock. That said, it's time to cook the steak and make the quick pan sauce that my wife assures me is the most delicious of all of these. I am a purist when it comes to seasoning steaks, especially when it's being paired with a very specific sauce. That said, if you want to maximize flavor with some sort of a rub, you do you. But I'm gonna season this heavily with just kosher salt and sear it in hot grapeseed oil. I used to roll my steaks around multiple times because I thought it got me the best results, but then years ago, one of my line cooks was so good at cooking steak on our wood-fired grill that I called him Maestro. And he cooked one side and then he cooked the other side, and they were perfect, edge to edge every time. So that's what I do now. I flipped it halfway through and then I kissed the sides on a hot pan. If you start to see a lot of white smoke coming off your pan, you should turn the heat down a little bit, but other than that, I like to keep it hot. Then I turned the heat off and poured the fat out and added butter, an unpeeled clove of garlic, and thyme, and basted it over low heat until it's at your desired doneness. If you're using a thermometer and you want to make it medium rare, I would take the steak out of the pan once it hits 120 degrees Fahrenheit and let it rest for about 10 minutes while you finish your fries. And if you're going with a pan sauce option, finish that up as well. I'm making sauce Diane, which according to the French Cooking Encyclopedia does not exist, but the internet disagrees. While my steak was cooking, I trimmed and sliced 2 cremini mushrooms, and I found these chestnut mushrooms at my supermarket, and they did not disappoint. I just trimmed the bottom off of a few of these, and I already had minced shallot, but you're gonna need that, as well as fresh tarragon, which can be frustratingly difficult to find given just how delicious it is, but thankfully the dried stuff might not look great, but it still smells pretty good. I poured the fat out of the pan and added the mushrooms, which I seasoned with salt and sauteed over high heat until they were starting to take on a light brown color. And I added about a tablespoon of shallots and a few tablespoons of booze. Almost every recipe you'll find where you flambe something includes brandy, which I happen to dislike drinking, and I'll be honest, most of this bottle is not getting lit on fire. But I do love Calvados, which is a Norman brandy made from apple cider, and it is delicious. So I use that instead. This is less a fire hazard and more of a singed hair hazard, so do be careful. Take the pan off the burner fully, add the alcohol, keep your face back, and slide it back onto your burner, and it will light on fire for just a few seconds. Then in went a small spoonful of Dijon mustard and a few shakes of Worcestershire sauce, or English sauce, as one of my former bosses called it, along with some reduced veal stock, and I cooked it down until most of the liquid is gone. If you're using store-bought beef stock, just do the same thing. You'll just have to cook it down for a little bit longer. Then add a splash of heavy cream and cook it until the sauce is thickened, and finish it with salt to taste, tarragon, and freshly ground black pepper. These pan sauces come together fast and easy, and they are fantastic. Finishing the fries is as easy as bringing the tallow to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, dunking the spuds for just a minute or so until they're golden brown, scooping them into a bowl with paper towel, and seasoning them with salt. I did save at least half of the steak for my wife, promise. But anyway, that's all for me on this one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.